Hey everybody, Kurt Dare from Legacy Land and Homes, licensed real estate broker here in Poughkeepsie, New York. Today's video is two rants. Probably gonna upset some real estate professionals and maybe even some attorneys, as well as the National Association of Realtors, but I feel like this is something that the public needs to be aware of, and I don't think the message is getting out very well, so I thought this was a video worthy of making. First rant is this lawsuit from the National Association of Realtors regarding commissions. You've probably heard about it, seen it in the news, talking about how sellers are paying for the buyer's agent's commissions and how this is a problem. And the reality is that's not true. It's completely untrue. It shouldn't be out there. I don't know why people are still talking about the other issues and not focusing on the fact that this is just not accurate information. So when a seller hires a real estate broker to sell their home, for example, if somebody's going to hire me to be their listing agent to sell their home, they're hiring me not to put the property in the multiple listing service. They're not hiring me to put it on Zillow and other platforms, syndications. What they're hiring me to do is to, although I do those things, they're hiring me to find them a buyer. And I'm going to do everything I can to find that buyer. But it's in their best interest, and I have a fiduciary responsibility to always put my client's best interests first, and it's in their best interest to be open up to all offers, not just from offers from buyers that I locate. And so that's the reason why we use the multiple listing service, is because it allows us to get a wider view of buyers for our clients. And so if a buyer is working with an agent from a different company, we don't want to ignore them from making an offer. We want their offers. We want to get as many offers in as we can, because if we can create a multiple offer situation, we can create that higher offer bidding or auction mentality that usually will get top dollar for the property. And in doing so, there's certain things that I have to do as a listing agent. We do things such as marketing, advertising. We hire a photographer, videographer. We do social media campaigns. We do actual social media advertisements, not just posts. These are all things that we do to generate interest for buyers to come and look at the property. But then once we get a buyer that makes an offer and the seller has accepted an offer, there's a whole nother litany of tasks that need to be completed, from meeting with the appraiser, meeting with a home inspector, reviewing a home inspection report, working with the lender, making sure paperwork is getting processed, making sure municipal search is being ordered. There's a long list of things that need to be done. Now, if the buyer is working with me directly, then I'm doing all that work. But if a buyer is working with another agent from another agency, and that's the offer that the seller has chosen as the best offer for them, well, then in that situation, the buyer's agent is going to be responsible for that. And although I'm going to oversee and make sure that they're being done, I don't have to do the day-to-day. That buyer's agent is in charge of doing all that work. And doing so, I agree to share my commission with them, because they're doing work that I don't have to do. Now, ideally, I charge a commission, and this is a made-up number. Let's say it's 10%, right? It's not a realistic number, but let's say the commission is 10%. Well, if I go out and I market and advertise and I locate a buyer, and that buyer presents an offer that's the best offer in the eyes of the seller, well, then I've earned my commission from the beginning all the way to the end when it closes. But if that buyer happens to be working with another agent, well, they're going to do a certain amount of work. And for that, I'm going to share it. Now, historically, most brokers usually split the commission 50-50. Now, with Legacy Land and Homes, myself, it's my company, I've never really agreed with that mentality, and I don't split it 50-50. And the reason being is very simple. Listing agents have more expense for every transaction than a buyer's agent does. A buyer's agent, they don't pay for videos and photography and advertisements, not for lead generation, for the actual property sale. Their expense really is limited to their gas and their time. Well, as a listing agent, I have time also. I might have some gas, but not as much as a buyer's agent. But I have a lot of other costs that I don't. So I don't necessarily share it 50-50, but traditionally that's what most brokerages have done. But the problem is our industry has created this problem. The real estate profession has done a horrible job and has gotten very lazy. And so the lawsuits from that standpoint, I can understand. And the reason being is, when I got started in the business over 20 years ago, when you went to a closing table, the attorney cut one check to the listing brokerage. And then that listing brokerage would pay, if there was another agency involved that handled the buyer, they would cut a separate check outside of closing to that buyer's broker. What happened over the years is there were situations where maybe companies were doing very good financially, they deposited that check, the bank swiped all that account, and there was no money left to pay the buyer's agent afterwards. And there were other instances where buyer's agencies were upset and saying, hey, listen, Mr. Listing Company, you got paid at the closing. I want to get paid at the closing. I shouldn't have to wait another 3-5 days for it to clear your account. And so what we started doing is we started asking the attorneys in the state of New York, that is, can you cut 2 checks? Cut one from the listing agent and one to the buyer's agent. I'm going to cut it anyway. It's no different. It just makes it a little bit easier for all parties involved. And so what happened is, over the last 2 decades, sellers go to the closing and they see this happening. And they see a check going to the listing company, and then they see a check being cut to the buyer's agency. And they see it listed on their closing statement as a commission that they paid. That's the problem. We've allowed the perception that the seller is paying it. They're not paying it. I'm paying it as a listing agent. I received my full commission. If another agency was involved, I agreed with them to give them a portion of it. The seller isn't paying it. I don't know how this lawsuit got to see the inside of a courtroom. In my opinion, it should have been thrown out on merit long before it got to that point, but that's where we are today. And so, unfortunately, starting next month in August, we're going to see a change. And there's a couple of big changes, and it's not good. It's not good for buyers, and it's really not good for sellers because it's just muddying the waters and making things more confusing. But 2 things are going to happen. One, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, but all buyers will be required to sign a buyer's contract. Much like a seller signs a listing agreement or a selling agreement, a buyer has to sign a buyer's contract saying that you're going to work with that. That's good. It's good for the industry for 2 reasons. One, buyers now are going to be locked to working with an agent. And so they're going to do a little bit more research. And you're going to see a lot of the hobbyists and the part-timers and the people that just really aren't good at real estate leave the industry. I'm good with that. The other thing is, you're going to see this confusion as to who's responsible to pay the commissions and how it's going to transpire. If nothing changes between now and the middle of August, I believe it's August 18th it goes into effect. If nothing changes between now and then, what's going to take place is real estate brokerages will no longer be allowed to enter a co-brokerage fee, or the amount that I would pay another agency should they bring the buyer, in the MLS. Not only am I not allowed to list it anymore, but I can't even mention it in the MLS. And there's been talks, how are we going to get around this? What happens if a listing agent says they're not going to share their commission anymore? What does that mean for the buyer? Now the buyer is going to be responsible for paying their agent's commission. It's going to create a lot of chaos. But more importantly, what it's going to do is people that are on the lower end of affordability in an already really tight market that is extremely highly priced, they're going to have to pay more money. And right now, that's the last thing we need. We should be doing everything we can to make this easier for buyers, more affordable for buyers, not less affordable. Interest rates are already too high. So I think that's a bad thing. I'm going to continue. Nothing's going to change for me except for one fact. I will go back, my company will go back to its original plan of we collect 1 check at closing. Plain and simple. When there's a closing, that check will come to me, and then I will, outside of MLS, outside of the closing table, will continue to share my commission with a buyer's agent, assuming it doesn't become illegal, because they may continue to move between now and August 18th to change things and say that it's completely illegal. We can't share commission, which I think will create more lawsuits in the end. But ultimately, that's what we'll be doing at Legacy Land and Homes. So that's rant number 1. Rant number 2, and I'm going to upset a lot of real estate agents and professionals here. Real estate teams. This has been something that's been kind of eating away at me. So there are a lot of different real estate models. You have individual agents, you have individual brokers, and you have teams. And what a team is, typically you have one agent who's considered the rainmaker, and they're the one that has the name recognition in the industry and in the market. They do a lot of business, and so they go out, they generate the business, and then their team helps them. And a lot of times what it is you have buyer's agents below that rainmaker. So the rainmaker will go out, they'll take a listing, and they'll schedule an open house. And they'll have the buyer's agents that are on the team handle the open house. Nothing wrong with that. Buyers come in, they're not working with an agent, they try to establish a business relationship with them. Again, nothing wrong with that. The problem that I have, my rant, is that what we've seen is, much like how we created the perception of the sellers paying the commission to buyer's agents, which is inaccurate, but it appeared that way, we're kind of misleading the public again with these teams. And the reason being is what's happening is we now have teams with the rainmaker, and instead of the rainmaker going out and doing the business and then feeding additional tasks and buyer leads to the buying agents on the team, now what we have is everybody on the team, all of the business that's done. So for example, you might have a rainmaker and they might have, let's say, 8, maybe 10 agents below them. And they're the buyer's agents. And so every listings that they take, they have open house, they sign an open house. Every lead that comes in goes to those buyer's agents. What's happening is the rainmaker, they had the listing. They should get credit for that transaction in the multiple listing service. But when a buyer goes to one of those open houses and makes an offer on that house, or maybe even another house, that buyer's agent, they're the one that handled that transaction. That rainmaker had nothing to do with it. And yet, when they put it in the multiple listing service, they're entering the rainmaker or the team leader as the one who handled the transaction, and the buyer's agent as a secondary agent, or sometimes they'll flop them. But what they're doing is they're artificially inflating the rainmaker's statistics. And that's misleading. So I might even say it's outright lying. To me, it's misleading to the public. I think they're opening themselves up to huge lawsuits because you're not being honest with the public. You're telling the public, hey, I did 100 transactions last year, 120 transactions, whatever number. The reality is you didn't do it. Technically, you're not lying because multiple listing does show your name for those 100 transactions. But the reality is you had nothing to do with a good portion of them. The buyer's agent handled those. And so anytime we're misleading the public in our industry, I think it's a bad thing. And I think it needs to stop. I've got no problem with teams. There's nothing wrong with a team model, as long as the statistics are being reported correctly. I had a situation happen very recently. We had a closing, and it was this very scenario. We had a buyer's agent who was working with a buyer. I was the listing agent. They came and they presented an offer on our listing, and they ended up being the winning bidder. They had the highest offer. The seller accepted it. When it came down to the closing, the week of the closing, the buyer's agent asked me to put the team leader's MLS ID in on the transaction. I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it because they had nothing to do with it. Never spoke with that agent. That agent never showed the property. They were never at the property. They weren't part of the negotiations. They weren't part of the transaction in any form. And yet they wanted credit for it in the multiple listing service. I have a problem with that. So I refused to do it. And that's really what brought this rant on. So I hope, for the sake of these agents, that they'll stop participating in this misleading of the public, because I think it's going to open them up to a lot of lawsuits. And two, if you're working with a team or you've been contacted by a team, make sure you're getting the accurate results. For example, if that team had 10 agents and their team leader, so 11 altogether, and they closed 110 transactions last year. Well, 110 transactions in our marketplace, that's a lot of business. But if you break that down to the 11 people, that means they only did 10 transactions for that year. That's good, but it's not 110. 10 versus 110 you can see the difference in the marketing, right? And so what they're doing is they're trying to present themselves as this superstar that's way better than anybody else who's doing 10, 20, 30 transactions a year. They're doing 110 transactions a year. It makes them look better than they actually are. Again, misleading the public. So I hope you'll do your due diligence when it comes to hiring a brokerage and an agency and get to know the people themselves and find out, is the first interaction that they have with you a misleading one? Because if it is that somebody you really want to be working with? That's my rant for today. Thanks for stopping by.